James wasn't the same when he returned from the works. He trudged along with the slow trains, hardly saying anything to anyone. When the day was done, he'd retire to the shed and fall asleep without a word. I knew the express was important to him, Boko remarked to Edward, but not to this extent. Even the prospect of pulling Dowager Hat's special excursion didn't shake him from his stupor. Edward was worried. So he spoke to the Fat Controller. A few days later, James found himself working at Edward's station. He shunted in the yard and took Boko's branch line trains while the diesel pulled the express. Unfortunately, it didn't have the effect Edward had hoped for. Disgraceful, James grunted. Imagine pulling the express one week and being confined to a branch line the next. Come now, James, smiled Edward. I'm certainly glad you're here. And besides, it's a nice change of pace. I'll fall from grace if you ask me, grumbled James, and he bumped some trucks hard. Now, for all of his kindness, Edward had a tendency to be impatient. This was especially true when it came to his own trains. He hated being late. He wasn't as fast as the other engines and didn't like having to make up for lost time. Though he tried to be understanding, Edward's patience was wearing thin. James refused to bank trains up Gauns Hill and was sluggish with shunting. Time and time again, Edward was left picking up the slack. Just what time do you call this? Fussed Daisy as Edward bustled into the junction. I'm sorry, panted Edward. As I'm now late, I've got no time for excuses, glared Daisy. But I suggest you not make this a habit, my dear. The Fat Controller won't like it. He didn't, and after more delayed trains, he told Edward as such. Not wanting to make James feel worse, he took the blame himself. I'm sorry, sir, Edward sighed. It won't happen again. When Edward returned and found his yard in disarray, he had a sinking feeling it would happen again. He frowned when he saw James skulking about. We do have a timetable, you know. Pah, said James. It's just a branch line, not like there's an express to keep to time. That's quite enough, interrupted Edward. There's more to life than the express. You're not even trying to keep things in order. I expect my trains on my branch line to be timely. If you can't do that, just go back to sulking in the shed. Before James could reply, Henry arrived with the express and whistled for a banker. Don't worry, said Edward sharply. I'll get it. Come on, he huffed, hastily pushing the train up the hill. Settle down, grumbled Henry. Not so fast, groaned the coaches. At last, Henry was over the hill, and Edward hurried back to the station. Meanwhile, the trucks had noticed the look of guilt on James's face. It's been quite lovely knowing you all, said one, but I'll be bound for the scrapyard if this horrid thing keeps pushing me about. Takes a lot to upset Edward, commented a second. Couldn't go as an express engine, laughed another, and he's not much of a shunter either. That's enough, snapped James. With a hard bump, the trucks rolled out of the siding and onto the main line. At that moment, Edward appeared. He didn't see the signal or the trucks fouling the line. Oh dear, he winced. "Oh dear," echoed James, who was feeling rather guilty. Soon, Donald arrived with the breakdown train. And the Fat Controller. "I am disappointed, James," he scolded. "Edward asked me to send you here to take your mind off your mishap. This is not a kind way to thank him. I expect you'll pull your weight while Edward is inspected. Is that clear?" James was ashamed, and the message was crystal clear. Thankfully, Edward wasn't hurt, and he and the trucks were soon back on the rails. "I'm sorry, Edward," he said in the shed that night. "I've been nothing but a nuisance since I arrived." "Well," replied Edward, "that accident could have been avoided had I not been so hasty. I'm sorry for being short. I know these changes have been hard for you." "Well," added James sadly, "if I can't handle simple shunting or branch line trains, maybe I don't deserve the express." "Tomorrow seems like a perfect chance for a fresh start," smiled Edward. "There is a passenger train to take, and my coaches would be thrilled to be pulled by a mainline engine." For the first time in days, James smiled. A fresh start was just what he needed.